Hi all, and welcome to another episode of Vladja's Chess Adventures. In today's video I want to take a look at a game that I played last Friday evening against a club colleague of mine, Jarno Witkamp. Currently Jarno is also the club champ, so it gave a nice feeling to be able to beat him, because that's what I did in this game. I was playing white, Jarno of course black. I opened with d4. Now Jarno usually plays King's Indian setups, so we get in that territory now, e4, d6. These are all well-known theoretical moves, and now normally black first castles before playing knight a6 for instance, but Jarno plays knight a6 here immediately. And he does not really have in mind to play the usual idea with e5 and then hoping to bring the knight to c5. No, rather in this position he hopes to play c5 and then maybe to recapture with the knight on c5. I continued my development with bishop e2, and indeed c5 is now played. Now I think the most principled response here is d5, which I played, because now the knight will not be able to hop into c5. Therefore Jarno reroutes it to c7 in order to try and support any future b7, b5 thrust, which is of course a typical plan for this Benoni kind structure. Okay, I castled, and now Jarno plays rook b8, bringing another piece into the game, and also meant to support the thrust of b7, b5. And now I quickly played h3 here. Now the idea of h3 is of course to stop any black piece from coming to g4. Normally if black would play for instance the bishop to g4 and exchange it for either the knight or the bishop on f3 or e2, he would get rid of one light piece and therefore would not really suffer from the lack of space that he is in currently, and which is also typical of course for all these Benoni structures. Now you can ask yourself the question, is it relevant to try and prevent bishop g4 for instance? Because in this position maybe black will need the bishop not to exchange itself, but maybe to be brought to this diagonal from where it can further support the advance of the b7, b5 pawn, also in conjunction of course with a7, a6 and these pieces. Because if black would exchange his light square bishop on f3 and white would be able to recapture with his bishop for instance, then it might be possible for white to try and just answer b7, b5, maybe with b2, b3, and just try and hang on to his pawns here, which are really hampering black's knight, because it's very difficult of course for the c7 knight to become active in that case. Anyway, apart from bishop g4, the move h2, h3 also prevents a possible knight g4 of course, and that's also a nice benefit of this move. It also creates a retreat square here on h2 for the bishop that will come to this diagonal soon. Okay, now there's too many arrows now, so let's go on to the next move, or rather let's go back one move, because after rook b8 there was another interesting option, but it didn't really appeal to me, and of course that option would be queen a4 check, trying to gain some kind of advantage because of the double attack on both king and undefended a-pawn. Of course the a-pawn is undefended because of the rook moving to b8, but let's have a look at what could transpire after queen a4 check, which to my opinion is a little bit early and doesn't white really offer any hope for an opening advantage. Okay, so black would play bishop d7 in that case, and there would follow queen takes a7, And now black can try to play in a Volga gambit style with b7, b5, which is quite nice. Now, if I were to take that pawn with the knight, then of course black would take my e4 pawn with his knight, I suppose, at some stage. So let's have a look at c takes b5, just trying to gain this pawn. But then I suppose one of the points of rook a8 b8 comes to light, because after rook a8 white really has nothing better than to repeat the moves, because black is constantly changing his queen here. So this really would not be the way to go about it, and after rook b8 I quickly played h3 as mentioned. Okay, now Jarno played here castles, and I now developed my bishop to f4. Because black may be preparing to play b7, b5, of course, white's trump in these positions, especially when there is not sitting a knight here, is of course to try and push e4, e5. And e4, e5 would endanger the knight on f6 and also the pawn on d6, which could become a serious liability. Okay, I'm just taking a sip of my tea because I'm suffering from a nasty cough. Anyway, black played here a6, further preparing the thrust b7, b5, and of course I want to try and prevent that for as long as possible. I play here a2, a4. And now, very much to my surprise, Jarno played here b5. And at first this looks like a very reasonable try, but I do think that it is a dubious move, and that this move comes too early, and that black is not prepared well enough for the following consequences. Well, I didn't put my a and c pawns there for nothing, so I just start taking. A takes b5, and of course Jarno retreats now, or recaptures I should say. And for the moment I am a pawn up after c takes b5. My pawn is protected 2 times by the knight on c3 and the bishop on e2, but of course Jarno's point is now to play bishop d7, threatening to recapture the pawn because he is now attacking it 3 times. Okay, now until this point I had played rather quickly. I played that quickly that I was well within my margin of no longer thinking than 5 minutes per move, so I had some minutes to spare for this 5-minute thinking per move. I refer you to the one of the previous posts on my blog, if you like. It's called How to Fight Perfectionism in Chess. And so therefore, since I had some time spared, so to say, I really took a deep think here, because I realized that now I must play a move that is very much to the point. And at first I was thinking maybe I should just try and protect my pawn on b5 for the 3rd time, you know, and just hope for black that he will never see it again. And, well, then I would have an extra passed pawn on the b file, and maybe then in this case I would just proceed and win the game somehow from there. So, of course, my thinking went, well, what are my candidate moves? How can I protect this pawn? Let's have a look at that first. So, of course, I looked at queen d3, but queen d3 has the disadvantage that my protecting pieces are now in the wrong order, and of course, after a move such as knight takes b5, I cannot really recapture, because in the process I would lose my queen, because my queen is in front of my bishop here. So in this case black would have easily equalized. Okay, well then after bishop d7 there was also of course queen b3, but queen b3 puts the queen into the half-open file for black's rook, and black would have a small combination, namely knight takes b5, recapturing the pawn. Now I can take a piece, but black would also regain the piece. Now again I would take the piece, but after queen takes b6 it becomes clear that black is regaining his piece and has a fantastic position, or at least an equal position. Of course he has pressure against this weakness sitting here on b2. He also has this beautiful bishop pointing in that direction. This knight is also attacking this weak pawn. And yeah, normally now this dragon type of pawn position for black is usually very strong. So maybe white can play e4, e5 here to put a spanner in the works for black somehow. But I think that it's already in equal position here. So queen b3 also doesn't fit the bill. Well, then after bishop d7, let's have a look at queen a4. At least that has the advantage that the queen is not sitting in the line of the rook now. But then what after queen e8? Putting pressure to the b pawn for the 4th time, and of course now also indirectly looking at the queen, not with the rook, but over the diagonal using the bishop. So in this position I can no longer reinforce the pawn on b5, and I'm also going to lose it. I should probably have to move the queen out of the way, maybe something like queen c4, but then black will just simply recapture on b5, and I've just lost time. Black has regained the pawn, and with it some other positional advantages, such as the pressure along the b file. Okay, well, back again to the position after bishop d7. So defending is not really helping me, yeah? It doesn't really make sense to protect the pawn. I can also not interpose anything. I cannot really put one of my pieces here or here to try and interpose the black attacking pieces. Also, I cannot take any of the attacking pieces. So that's also not an idea for a defense. So if I cannot take anything, if I cannot interpose anything, if I cannot run away with the pawn, because obviously b5, b6 would just run into rook takes b6, no problem for black. And if I can also not protect the pawn, well, then maybe I should try for a counter-attack. So I've listed these options in an earlier video, also a Vladja chess adventure video. It was my game against Michiel van Schaik, you can look it up. That if you defend, there are 5 options. Let me recap them once more. It is taking the attacking piece, interposing something, going away with the attack piece, fleeing if you like, stepping out of the way, protecting the attacked piece, of course, and the counter-attack. Okay, well, since the first 4 don't really apply, don't really work out, I started looking, of course, at my own trump, my own counter-attack. So it didn't really take me too long to come up with the very strong and probably also refutation of black's whole idea with this early b7, b5 thrust. The idea, of course, is that I now play e4, e5. Now this has the benefit that I'm chasing the knight and that I'm also attacking the pawn on d6. So there is a very sudden crisis in black's camp, and he should decide on what to do now. Furthermore, putting a pawn on e5 blunts the activity of black's dragon bishop down the long diagonal, and also protects my knight from any exchange by this bishop on g7. My knight in turn, of course, being a defender of my b pawn. That was also important. So let's have a look at what black's possibilities are in this position. Now, it doesn't really look so nice to play this move. Let me add a new line, because then after knight takes e5, I am threatening either to take this attacking bishop or to put my knight on this super support square on c6, and also because of the fact that now this diagonal has opened up, black cannot really capture on b5 in a proper way, because of course the rook on b8 is then in danger. Let's see how that would go. For instance, knight takes b5. Black is now just trying to regain the lost pawn, but of course after knight takes d7 and queen takes d7, he now loses the exchange with bishop takes b8, and white is winning. So we can see some advantages already of the thrust e4, e5. Very typical move for white in these circumstances. So you're now refrained from playing d takes e5. Okay, but then if you don't take this pawn, then how to defend the knight? We're not going to take it. It's not possible to interpose anything between e5 and f6. So maybe we should protect the knight? No, but if we protect the knight, then the pawn would still take and we would win material. So we are left with either going away with the knight or playing a counterattack. Well, in the game, Jarno went away with the knight and at the same time played a counterattack. He played here knight h5. But already it seems that there is no salvation for him in this game. The other option, which was probably better for him by the way, was to go to e8 with the knight. Let's have a look at that. Because this still would have posed some problems for white. Now the nice thing here is that since the knight is now sitting on e8, the black queen can no longer go to e8 to pressure the pawn on b5. This means that, for instance, the move queen a4 has now become available. This move supports the b5 pawn, also prepares moves such as b2, b4, and sometimes also a switch to the king side with queen h4 after the bishop from f4 has moved out of the way. And white has other strengthening moves such as rook e1 and maybe followed by bishop c4 or bishop f1, etc, etc. But of course the most important thing to note right now is that white is hanging on to his extra b pawn. So this would give white a very serious advantage. Let's have another look. For instance, rook b7 to try and prepare, of course, queen b8, which pressures the b pawn in another way. But then after rook a3 and queen b8, white has rook b3 and he is still sitting on the position, as you can say. Okay, well that's not the only possibility that white has after knight fe8. He also has the interesting rook a5, trying to protect the pawn laterally. Now, of course, the rook is sitting in the diagonal of the queen, so we should be very careful. Because after knight takes d5, not knight takes b5, because rook takes b5, and white will win material, you can check that. But after knight d5, of course, white should realize that he has the opportunity for a successful exchange, a sacrifice. And maybe this is one of the differences between the weaker and the stronger player, is that the stronger player doesn't immediately discard such a move as rook a5 because of the discovery with knight d5, because he will realize, he will sense somehow, and will investigate, that there is the possibility of an exchange sacrifice. So after knight takes d5, black has regained his pawn. It's also very important always to keep track of the material count when you are doing analysis of your variations. So after knight takes d5, for instance, we can say, okay, white is a pawn up. Of course, black can now recapture the rook, and now is an exchange up. But the line goes on, because after knight takes e7, white has already gained a knight and a pawn for the exchange, and after king h8 and knight c6, for instance, he is attacking both rook and queen. So black is forced to give up this white square bishop to take away this dangerous knight, but after b takes c6, white has a very strong and dangerous passed pawn here. Also, he is of course threatening some things along this diagonal here, and black's pieces at the moment are sitting on strange squares. Now, probably strongest for black in this position is to try and ignore the tension between d6 and d5. Very funny, to play d5 himself here. And in doing so, for the moment he blunts the activity of the white light pieces on f3 and on f4, because they're a little bit hampered by the pawn on e5 for the moment. And the strongest move here really is to play queen takes d5, but then after knight c7, you know, black is setting up some kind of a blockade and has some slim chances for survival. But yeah, despite being exchanged down, white in this position has a very strong passed pawn on c6. He has the bishop pair. He has 2 pawns anyway for the exchange, and I suppose that, well, after a move like queen c4 or maybe queen d7, that's not so clear, he can maintain a nice advantage. Okay, now I wanted to take a look at another line, because after knight d5, when momentarily white is a piece up, you could think, okay, well, why not interpose e6 and then recapture with the queen on a5, because now for the moment the knight cannot go to e7. Well, the knight cannot go to e7. Hello, I'm a piece up with white, so I'll just re-surrender this piece with knight e7, luring the queen to e7, when now currently the material count is even, but it becomes clear that after e takes d6, white has a winning position, of course. He's a pawn up, and what a pawn this is. This is a thorn in black's flesh here. Okay, so these considerations show you that the move rook a5 comes into consideration next to queen a4, which is also an interesting option because of the fact that the queen can no longer go to e8. Okay, and let me mention, after queen a4, for instance, also knight, let me indicate that with red, knight f6 to h5 attacking the bishop is not possible because the knight was chased and this pawn was put here on e5. Now, had the knight still been on f6 and the pawn still on e4, then of course knight h5 chasing the bishop would also open up the diagonal from the bishop to the knight, after which black would be able to exchange this knight when white would lose a defender of the pawn on b5. But also in this position, queen e8, as we saw earlier, would have been very interesting and good for black. Okay, back to the game, where I think that after e5, knight fe8 would have posed white the most problems. Jarno, however, played knight h5. And I'm not sure, because I didn't speak to him after the game, because he preferred to just go for a walk and not go into the post-game analysis. I can only guess, like I said, I'm not sure. Maybe Jarno had missed the fact that after the strong bishop h2, I'm not only threatening to take on d6, but I'm also simply threatening to win the knight with g4. Because look at the squares that are available for the knight, or rather look at the squares that are not available for the knight on h5. I've indicated them with yellow. They're on g3, f4, f6 because of the pawn here on e5 and g7, of course. So all these squares are not available, so g2, g4 is simply threatening to win a piece. So yeah, black is now really in dire straits, and it's now very difficult to try and contain the damage. But I think that's what you're supposed to do when you're on the defensive in such a position. You should somehow try and stop the tide, to try and consolidate your position to the best of your ability, and just take into account that if you try to stop any small damage, you may end up with huge damage, and that if in the first place you take some loss, some bigger loss, then in the end you will also have the opportunity of somehow containing the damage. So if you take the beating in the first moment, then the beating will be less worse in the end. If you try, even when defending, to try and prevent small beating, then in the end you will end up with a big beating. And this is exactly what happened in this game, even though it is very difficult to try and improve upon black's defensive play. But let's have a look anyway, because in the game Jarno played d takes e5. Now d takes e5 prevents g2, g4, because the knight could go back to f6, yeah? And also d takes e5 prevents white from taking on d6 himself. But it of course has the big disadvantage that after d takes e5 the knight jumps into e5, and we can see that both white bishops are starting to work very strong now. The bishop on h2 is working all the way to b8. The bishop on e2 is simply threatening to take the knight on h5, also ruining black's pawn structure in the process. And white's knight will also jump into c6, threatening the pawn on e7 and the queen and the rook on b8, so black would have to give up the bishop, after which he would have two tremendously strong connected pawns on the queen side. So, yes, big consequences this capture has for black. But then, okay, after bishop h2, what else could he do? Well, probably the best way to try and contain the damage would be to play knight takes b5. For the moment the material count is even, but now of course there is an exchange here and a recapture. But after g4 and knight f6, black will lose his piece, e takes f6. But after bishop takes f6 and rook a2, for instance, to protect the weak pawn on b2, let's take stock for a moment. Let's just take stock. This bishop is not so active. At least it's not attacking any knight on h5 anymore. This bishop is also not so active. It is blunted by the pawn on d6, so no more activity there. This knight is also not so active. It can no longer go to these squares anymore. This pawn is lonely, is weak. This pawn is lonely, is weak, is sitting here on this half-open file. And black's pieces, on the contrary, are very strong. Black is applying pressure like this and like this, and the queen has opportunities to add to the pressure, and maybe the rook can come to the c or the b file. And this is exactly what I mean with containing the damages. It looks like you don't want to lose a piece, so you want to try and prevent small beating. But if you just give up your piece in this position and you get one pawn in return, and also the fact that white's pieces are all of a sudden a lot less active and he's settled with some weaknesses himself, then probably this is the best way to go about it. So, yeah, in retrospect, or when analyzing the position, I think that Jarno should have played here this consolidating idea of knight takes b5 and then just giving up the knight on f6. Okay, well, like I said, after bishop h2 and d takes e5, he just allows all of white's pieces to overwhelm him. Of course I played here knight takes e5 with all the advantages that I mentioned earlier. Now, was there a second option here to try and contain the damages for as much as possible? Let's have a look. Of course, Jarno now wants to try and prevent the loss of a pawn on h5 and the ruining of his pawn structure there. So he played knight h5, but that allowed my knight to come into c6, reaching an overwhelming positional advantage. So, could he have done something else on this moment? Well, let's again have a look at knight takes b5. It's already less attractive, but at least he would have been able to force white to give up some of his most active pieces, with knight d7 for instance, opening up the diagonal towards the rook on b8. But now in between, for instance, knight takes c3, b takes c3, and after queen takes d7, white can win the exchange, but after bishop takes h5, g takes h5, he is still saddled with a few weaknesses. Now, of course, this position is winning for white, but I suppose that he would have needed some more technique than in the game. After queen f3, this position is a clear win, of course. So already we can see that this kind of containment is already coming too late, and Jarno should have tried to play knight takes b5 one move earlier. Okay, well, having said that, after knight takes e5, it makes sense that he now played knight f6. But we can now see that white can make full use of his positional trumps, because of course he now jumps in with the knight to c6. We can usually only dream of such a support point for the knight, and it's obvious that this beast has to be exchanged. So bishop takes c6 followed, and now not b takes c6 because of the hanging d pawn, but of course d takes c6. And now look at this pawn duo. It is going to decide the day, of course. And note that it is 2 times attacked and 2 times protected. And material count is now also 1 pawn up still for white. And he has the bishop pair, and he has an open a file, and he can also use the half open d file. And furthermore, he is simply threatening to exchange queens, after which the knight on c7 would be unprotected and could be captured by the bishop on h2. Let's not forget this raking bishop. It is still very much in the game. Okay, that explained why Jarno tried here queen c8. There's no saving the game anymore, so we will just cruise through until the end and see what transpired and how I won the game. Of course, now there is an important technique in chess. It's a tactical technique. The knight on c7 is pinned. Now, what do you usually do with pinned pieces? Well, you attack them. So I played rook a7. Now I'm attacking the knight for the second time. And the knight cannot really move away, because then of course the pawn on e7 will fall, or the rook on b8 will fall, and where would the knight go? Maybe to a8 or e6? Anyway, white would win a significant amount of material, of course. So Jarno felt forced here to play the very passive knight fe8, reinforcing this knight and trying to hold on the black squares for the moment, because for the moment I cannot really push my pawn, because then it will simply be captured by the rook. So he is just like I said, he is trying to reinforce his position here, a blockading position on the black squares. But of course it's all too little too late. I now play queen d7. Now the nice idea here is that I'm attacking the knight for the 3rd time. And black cannot take my queen, because after the recapture with my pawn, let's have a look at that. We can enter that as a new line. I would recapture the queen, of course, and I would attack the defender of the knight on c7, and also by exchanging queens, the queen on c8 is no longer protecting the knight, so I'm winning a lot of material here. That's not possible. So after queen d7, of course now Jarno tries to blunt the activity of my bishop with e5. Now this makes a lot of sense, of course, and forces me now to really start thinking, okay, how am I concretely going to win this game now? I saw quite quickly that after queen takes c8, which forces the black rook away from the b file, I can easily start moving my free pawns now with b6. And after knight e6, I calculated as far as knight d5, which is threatening a very nasty check and also is indirectly protecting my pawn on c6. So therefore king h8, and now after knight d7 check, attacking the rook, white is winning material. And I realized that I was winning this position, but I felt a little bit awkward about the fact that my bishop and rook and other bishop are not really participating in the game at the moment. Of course, I could have played this, it would have saved me some time on the clock, but instead I opted for a more, well, let's call it a more arty move. Because after e5, I thought, well, maybe queen takes c8 wins on short notice, but if I play here f4, then I will win using the whole of my army. Now, of course, this move is designed to win another pawn here on e5 and to open up the f file, and we can see that there is some very serious pressure then against the pawn on f7. Also, after excuse me, after such a move as e5, e4, my plan, of course, was to play f4, f5. Putting some new life into my bishop, and of course also trying to open up the f file. I would have an overwhelming position in this case. So after f4, Jarno saw nothing better than to try and defend with knight e6. Now, this makes sense, of course, because the knight on c7 was a target, so he moves it out of the way, and he is kind of threatening, quote unquote, to exchange queens now, because then my pawns would no longer be connected. Okay, well, I recognized this, and I first exchanged queens, luring the black rook away from the b file, so that I will have a chance to play b5, b6 later on. And now I earned my second pawn here. F takes e5. Okay, opening up the pressure against the f7 square, and just preparing moves, such moves as b5, b6, and knight d5, etc. Okay, well, it was very difficult here, of course, to defend. The position is clearly lost. Jarno could have tried bishop h6, maybe to try and bring the bishop into the defense somehow, with the emphasis on somehow, because I don't really see what this bishop would be doing there. It would just maybe just be kicking. But after f takes e5, he tried to free up his pieces a little bit with knight 8 to c7. But of course this allowed b6. And now this was his final defensive point, rook a8. Of course, if I take now on c7 with the pawn, then I lose my rook on a7. But beauty, 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 I have another rook, and I very firmly put it on a1. So there followed an exchange now on a7, and of course I recaptured with my rook, because then I keep my pawns connected. And now the knight on a8 on c7 is attacked, so he moved it to a8, attacking my pawn here. And I didn't want to play b7 immediately here, because that would somehow give him the opportunity to set up the blockade again with knight a c7. Of course, I'm winning in this position, for instance, with such moves as knight b5, knight d5, but I prefer to choose another order. After knight a5, I first moved my knight into d5. Now, you could think, for the moment, this means that my bishop is unprotected, because the knight on c3 was protecting that bishop. So, Jarno could have tried knight d4. But let's not forget that knight from d4 is also losing touch with c7, and then b7 would have been a very simple win for me here. For instance, knight takes e2, king f2, and the knight on a8 is a goner, and I will also promote with one of my pawns. So after knight d5, Jarno did not play knight d4, but now moved his bishop into a more active position. But of course now I started pushing my pawns with b7, because now after knight 8 takes c7, I can at least immediately exchange one of these blockaders, which is what I did. Knight takes c7. There was an in-between check here, bishop e3. And now I didn't want to put my king on the f-file, because I had an idea of pushing my e-pawn, unleashing the power of my bishop. And in that case, my king would be in the same line as the rook, so I played king h1 here. Now black must recapture his knight. Knight takes c7, and of course, as mentioned, e5, e6 now simply wins, because I'm attacking now this blockader. And this blockader is also, by the way, the defender of the a8 square, where I desperately want to go with my rook, of course. So Jarno tried his last trick with c4, opening up this diagonal and attacking my rook. And now there were several wins here. Rook a8 wins anyway, e6, e7 wins anyway, but in slight time trouble I played a safe move. I played here rook a4, putting my rook on a white square, threatening bishop takes c7, also threatening e6, e7, sometimes threatening rook b4, supporting my b pawn, or threatening rook takes c4, etc., etc., completely winning, of course. And now, in order to protect the blockader on c7, Jarno played bishop b7, but now I had a very simple forced win, starting with e7, another free pawn, oh dear, rook e8, and now I played the very simple bishop takes c7, not afraid of bringing about bishops of opposite colors, because with bishop takes c7 I annihilate the defender of the a8 square, and after bishop takes c7 and rook a8 I had managed to reach the time control, and after a short while Jarno resigned. Well, that ends the discussion of this episode of Vladja's Chess Adventures. Let's do a small recap of the game. I didn't really like the way Jarno treated the opening. It's not that his idea was wrong, but I think that his timing with a7, a6 and b7, b5 was wrong. But of course only because of the fact that I have this very strong e4, e5 thrust. So you should remember that in these kinds of positions it's usually this queenside thrust for black against this center thrust for white. And because of the fact that black's pieces are somehow a bit weird, this thrust is almost immediately winning. Now I think that black should have tried knight fe8, which would have been more tenacious. After knight h5 I played the strong bishop h2, also adding g2, g4 to the threats. And there were some options here. Instead of d takes e5, for instance, knight takes b5, which would have contained the damage for black. But after d takes e5, white's activity reached a climax somehow with knight takes c6, bringing about a fairly easily winning positional advantage. Of course, now I started to attack the pinned knight on c7. You can see how unfortunately Black's knights and other pieces are posted. And now after f4 I played, or excuse me, after e5 I played the rt f4 to try and bring my rook and bishop into the game also. Okay, now I can start moving my connected passed pawns. There were some final tactical tricks, but obviously in this position the pushing of my pawns simply decided things in my advantage. So the final blockade of the black squares is now relinquished after bishop takes c7 and rook a8. We saw some interesting techniques. For instance, the idea that I played the opening very quickly, but only started thinking, and I mean thinking very deeply, because I think I spent some 20 minutes or so in this position before playing e4, e5, when I realized that I had to play very carefully. Because somehow I was surprised by the fact that Black had played b7, b5, and then moved his bishop to d7, just very simply trying to recapture this pawn, after which he would have a good structure. But I realized that it shouldn't be so easy, and it wouldn't be fair somehow, you know, just technically, that Black would have such an easy game. So yes, e4, e5, very important to remember. And of course, before playing this move, I used a technique to try and find out my candidate moves by going through the 5 different options for defense, which are taking an attacking piece, putting something in between, going away with the attacked piece, trying to protect the attacked piece, in this case the pawn on b5, or trying the counter attack. So in using this technique I ran down the moves, and I calculated e4, e5 in the end, which was of course a very strong move. Okay, well then some other aspect came to light, is that in these kinds of positions it's very important to try and contain the damage as early as possible, even when it means giving up a piece. Black should have tried something like this in this line, because he would have had a very tenacious position here. Of course White has good winning chances and maybe is even winning, but it will take him a lot of effort to actually bring about the winning position, whereas after d takes e5, knight e5, the position played more or less by itself, you know, and I think that's the big difference. Does the position play itself, or do you really have to figure out how to go about it, how to go about bringing or coasting your advantage home? Okay, I think that ends my final remarks on this game. I hope you've enjoyed it. So signing off for you is Voldemort. I hope to see you again next time. Bye bye.